G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with episode 4 of Australia's National Day of Shame. Book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. In the first 3 episodes we've already talked about the layout of Darwin and what started to happen when the bombers came over. We might as well have a look at some of the illustrations that do appear in the book. The attack upon the harbour. Here we see a map, and what it shows is the railway and the road coming into town, Parrop Station, which I guess that's probably a railway station, Parrop Camp. We have the oil tanks there. We have a very strange looking wharf with a 90-degree bend in the wharf. Over here, little cluster there, that's the administrative officers, police station and the courthouse. Number 7 over there, that's an anti-aircraft battery. We have a few parallel streets. We have the hospital, and number 2 out there, that's Larrakia Barracks. Up here we have the civilian aerodrome, and over here we have the RAAF aerodrome, and that just sort of shows you the Timor Sea and Ambon and Melville Island. Just sort of bit of an overview. That shows the aerial view of the aftermath of the bombing, with that strange 90-degree angled wharf put out of action. The Neptuna lies on her side beside the shattered wharf is the caption. A dramatic picture of the jetty at the height of the raid. Smoke billows from the doomed Neptuna and Barossa. First minutes of the raid, Allied ships on fire. Neptuna, loaded with high explosive, blows up alongside the wharf. In the foreground, a small boat braves the blazing oil to pluck survivors from the water. The hospital ship Manunda, severely damaged in a deliberate attack by a Japanese dive bomber. As the text said in yesterday's episode, you'd think a dive bomber could see the red crosses on the hospital ship. Ship's boat carries survivors to the hospital ship Manunda, that would be before the dive bombing attack. The tanker British motorist, bombed and machine gunned by Japanese dive bombers. She capsized and sank shortly afterwards. No caption on that, but I think it's the Neptuna in the background and the Manunda in the foreground. And judging by the flash hood, it's taken from a naval vessel, either American or Australian. Fire crews helplessly watch the inferno of blazing oil tank alight from a direct hit. And there's your fire crew, firefighting an oil tank in a tin hat, short sleeve shirts, shorts and army boots. But they have got a shield and a hose, with a bit of pressure in the hose. So, let's move on to the text. Okay, so we're looking at a 20-page chapter, so I'll probably only do 10 of them on this movie. We'll see how we go with the time. I reckon I can go another 20 minutes. Can't do a page a minute. This is called the attack on the harbour. Intelligence reports had told Captain Fuchida, Commander Fuchida, that he could expect to find Darwin Harbour an attractive target, but he could hardly believe his eyes as he came within sight of it for the first time. There below him, trapped like rabbits in a snare, were no less than 45 ships. He led his force in a wide sweep around the town, positioning them for the first attack and expecting at any moment to be met by a furious onslaught from guns on the ground. But there was nothing. Not a shot was fired. Even as he came over the town and was laying his aim on the ships in the harbour, he could see people apparently going about their business unconcernedly. The first bombs went away, and only then did a few anti-aircraft guns come to life. He knew exactly what his priorities were, and so, if they had followed their briefing, did every member of his team. The Japanese had evolved a scheme which allowed them to bomb with great accuracy even when they were using semi-skilled aircrews, and he was able to use this with devastating effect on Darwin. Each bomber had a bomb site, but in most cases this was not used. Instead, there was only one bomb aimer in each flight, and he located the target, and at the critical moment waved a flag that the crews of the other aircraft would see. This was the signal for them to all release their bombs simultaneously, and it ensured a highly effective bombing pattern. Assuming that the aircraft with the only bombardier manages to get to the target and hasn't been shot down by fighters along the way. The Yankees did the similar sort of thing when they were bombing Italy in the Middle East in the Second World War, but each one of their aircraft actually had a bombardier on board, so that if the lead bombardier's ship went down, they could still bomb. Maybe not as well, maybe not as tightly, but they could still bomb. What do we see here? If the leader's aircraft was destroyed, the crew of the plane immediately to his right would normally take over the role. They just finished telling us a paragraph before there was only one bombardier in the whole flight, so... Fuchida expected the main opposition to come from the guns of the American warships that had returned the previous evening with the ill-fated convoy, although its fate would have been a great deal worse if it had come within range of Admiral Nagumo's armada. Their first priority was to destroy the US warships, followed by the Australian and American merchant vessels that were being used to carry men and supplies. The wharf was another important target. It was an extraordinary situation that so many ships were in the harbour to start with, when a raid was expected at any moment, and when the place was virtually undefended. Responsibility for positioning the ships in the harbour, though not of course for the fact that they were there in the first place, rested with a senior naval officer, Captain Edward Perry Thomas. Malt liquor military history. Coopers. 5.8% alcohol. Thomas, who had been a serving member of the Royal Navy, had come to Australia in 1936 to get his wife away from the English climate. He had been put on the RAN Reserve, and soon after the outbreak of war he was appointed to a naval command in Darwin. He was expected to take full command of all shipping in the harbour in the event of hostilities. He had been a serving officer since 1904, and before coming to Australia had specialised in mining and anti-submarine warfare, but he had no experience of berthing or of running an operation such as Darwin Harbour. Major General Blake, the senior army officer in Darwin, described Thomas as a man of meticulous knowledge and a man who dots every I and crosses every T and personally attends to everything himself, unquote. He was also, it was suggested, a man who might well be expected, quote, to create bottlenecks around him, unquote. Better than most people in Darwin, Thomas knew the risks that the return of the convoy involved. He knew where it had been going and what its purpose was, and as he put it, quote, it required no second sight and no military knowledge to realise that we would have visitors the following day. He therefore ordered the troops to be taken off the ships as quickly as possible. For some reason, however, this did not happen. And when the raid began, the Australian troops had been marched off their ships alongside the wharf, while the Americans were still holed up below decks out in the harbour. Thomas said afterwards that it has been, quote, a matter of complete indifference, unquote, to him whether the Australians or the Americans were taken off first, but that was not how most Americans saw it. By good fortune, they were able to escape after the raid began without a single loss of life, but the delay in disembarking them caused a great deal of ill will. The naval establishment for which Thomas was responsible consisted of shore-based facilities for refuelling ships, together with normal base headquarters and various smaller ships, including boom defence vessels and the repair ship Platypus of 3,455 tonnes. There were many critics of the way Thomas had allocated berths and anchorages in the harbour. A hospital ship, Menunda, lay only a cable's length from the destroyer Peary, and another ship, Neptuna, packed with high explosives, was tied to the wharf and in close proximity to at least 4 other vessels. It bothered Thomas himself that there was so much tonnage in the harbour, and as far as he reasonably could, he had attempted to allot berths and anchorages at greater distances than was normal with a fleet anchorage. During the previous evening, when working out the anchorages with his American counterpart, he had been tempted to disperse the ships even more, so sure was he that a raid would come the following day. But he had decided that they were far enough apart at least to prevent 2 ships being damaged by a single bomb. That's important. In the post-mortem that followed the raid, there were those who supported Captain Thomas and just as many who believed that his positioning of the ships in the harbour was a significant factor in the chaos that ensued. Certainly there was plenty of room in the harbour to have put much greater distances between the ships. Mariners did not look on Darwin Harbour as being a particularly good holding ground for anchors in poor weather, but in the moderate weather at the time it posed no danger. Warning of a raid for the ships on the harbour should have come first from a flag hoisted at naval headquarters on shore, accompanied by a blast on the foghorn. The first ship to see the warning would then sound its alarm, and this would be taken up by ships all over the harbour. That, at least, was the theory. When the flag went up that morning to announce the raid, the level bombers were already overhead, and as the first bombs were released, it was the repair ship Platypus who saw them. As the officer of the watch sounded the alarm, Platypus's captain, Acting Commander John Tomkin, who was below decks, but within 15 seconds he had bounded to the bridge. Tomkin, who was later one of the most bitter critics of the way the ships had been dispersed, had trained his own men well. In spite of outdated and inadequate guns, they shot down 1 dive bomber that day and a second aircraft only 3 weeks later when 3 Zeros attacked the town. An alert for naval vessels meant that the guns were to be manned, and Tomkin had practised his crew over and over again until he was satisfied that they could do it in their sleep. He had also instructed his engineer to give him steam at 1 hour's notice, and that morning he would have been able to move in a quarter of that time if the dive bombers had not caused serious damage to the engines. The fire from Platypus's guns was so intense that none of the dive bombers could get close enough to do more lasting damage, although a near miss sank the lugger Mavie, which was tied alongside. The Mavie's crew were thrown into the water and swam to safety. The major target for the Japanese was the destroyer Peary. After bringing the convoy safely home, Houston and Peary had refuelled and left at once, bound for the Java Sea. In the Timor Sea, however, Peary had encountered a submarine and had spent so much fuel chasing it around the ocean in an unsuccessful bid to depth charge it that she had to return to Darwin to take on more fuel. She left Houston to go on without her and arrived back at Darwin at 1 o'clock in the morning of the 19th. The hapless Peary must rank as one of the most star-crossed ships that fought in the war. Already 20 years old when Japan entered the war, she was caught in the Philippines during a Japanese raid only 3 days after Pearl Harbor and received a direct hit which killed 8 of her crew. She was dragged to safety, but only a fortnight later, oh dear, see how we go reading through blue. A fortnight later she was attacked in a second raid before finally, on the 28th of December, she got away from the Philippines. In the Celebes Sea, her radio failed, and this time she was attacked by 3 Allied aircraft which mistook her for a Japanese ship. She survived this, however, and sailed on only to be attacked the next morning by Japanese bombers which bombed her and fired torpedoes at her. She eventually arrived in Darwin and was sent out on escort duty with the convoy that had to turn back. She was the most severely damaged of all the ships in the convoy. Now she was cooped up in Darwin Harbour with a massive force of Japanese aircraft overhead and herself as the principal target. At 9:58 that morning, Lieutenant Commander John M. Birmingham's main concern as her captain was to get the Peary refuelled so he could set off after the Houston. He was impatiently pacing his bridge when he saw the Japanese aircraft coming into sight. Perhaps Peary's experience had taught him a hard lesson, but it never occurred to Birmingham for one moment that the aircraft were anything but Japanese. The moment he saw them, he ordered the anchor to be weighed, and as it came up, the engines throbbed and Peary began to move towards the relative safety of the open sea. Her guns went into action immediately and she fired fearlessly until she could fire no more, but she never had a chance. 5 bombs from the high-altitude level bombers struck her, the 4th forcing a way through to her ammunition magazine. Then the dive bombers took over, screaming down to finish her off, releasing one bomb after another. By now, Peary, ablaze from stem to stern, was drifting helplessly out of control down by the stern. Men were jumping off the forecastle into the water that was thick with oil and that would soon turn into a boiling inferno. Somehow her guns were still firing until the heat became so intense that their crews perished where they stood. The end came suddenly and dramatically. The bomb that had penetrated the ammunition magazine had been fitted with a delayed fuse, and now with one huge explosion, the Peary was engulfed in flames and dense black smoke. The force of the blast literally lifted her out of the water. Somehow 52 men survived, but 80 perished, along with her captain, John Birmingham. The second American warship was not so easy to dispose of. The William B. Preston, which had been in Darwin since January, was the mothership for the American Catalina flying boats. The first attack on her was a near miss, and she disappeared behind an enormous water splash. Like the Peary, she too had started to move almost before the first bombs fell, and it was the quick action by her first officer, bracket, her captain, Lieutenant Commander Etheridge Grant, was ashore, close bracket, which saved her from going to the bottom with Peary. She put up a billowing smokescreen, but not before she had received a direct hit on her stern. She narrowly missed 2 other ships, one of them the hospital ship Menunda, and zigzagged wildly across the harbour as she tried frantically to dodge the falling bombs. Perhaps her smokescreen deceived the Japanese into thinking that she was in her death throes, but they left her alone after a while, and then when they departed she made her escape and later reached Broome. 4 of her crew were killed. The 4 transports which had been in the convoy were next to be attacked. The USS Meigs, the largest ship in the harbour at 12,568 tonnes, had several direct hits, caught fire and quickly burned out, sinking with 2 of her crew. And the USS Mauna Loa was also bombed and burned out, taking to the bottom 5 of her crew. 2 bombs went through an open hatch and broke her back. The 3rd American merchant ship, the USS Port Mar, was machine-gunned and severely holed in the hull by a near miss. She beached near the leper colony on Channel Island and, by strange coincidence, close to the 4th troop ship in the convoy, the Australian vessel Turagi, which had also been beached. On the coastal trader Zealandia, 3rd Officer Charles Stewart, the officer who had seen the signals being passed to the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft earlier in that morning, was in the cabin washing some clothes when the first bombs exploded. His immediate impression was that the report was of a big gun, and he, quote, walked curiously across to the porthole. From the way the ship was lying, he could see straight across to the wharf, and as he looked there was a violent crash of firing, and he saw steam pouring from the whistle on Platypus as she sounded her alarm. He saw rather than heard her 3 blasts, and on the 3rd a huge column of smoke leapt up as the first salvo of bombs hit the wharf, straddling it diagonally. He turned, pulled on his shirt, and as he went to the door he glanced once more out of the porthole and watched in horror as a dive bomber released its bombs straight at him. Not silvery, as others had reported, but greeny-grey. Every man on the ship knew his action station, and Stewart's was at the forecastle head. Amidst the din that was going on all around him, he hurried to take up his position, knowing that his immediate task when he got there was to heave short the anchor. Once on the forecastle head, he ran to the steam valve to turn on the steam that he needed, but nothing happened. He tried once more, but there was no steam. What Stewart had no way of knowing was that the engine room repairs had been carried out on the Zealandia for the past week, and she had no steam up. With a raid fully expected that day, nobody had bothered to ensure that she had steam to enable her to get away. She was trapped, locked to the bottom of the harbour by her unshiftable anchor. I suppose if he cut the anchor rope, he'd then have to hoist sails, wouldn't he? In the short time that it had taken Stewart to get down the companion ways from his cabin to the forecastle head, the raid was at its height. Heavy salvos were falling all around them and shrapnel was whistling through the air. There was no cover at all near the steam valve, and Stewart, with a carpenter who was with him, ducked back to take cover under the break of the forecastle. They stayed there with their heads down for 10 minutes before Stewart once again braved the flying shrapnel, certain that by this time the ship would have steam up. After taking the evacuees south, the Zealandia had returned with supplies and ammunition, and the Japanese were now concentrating on the after end of the ship, presumably knowing that that was where the Zealandia carried the ammunition magazine. Large presumption. Very large presumption. It would take an enormous high-grade level of intelligence to brief the pilots on that. It was the bit that they were facing towards. It was where the bombs happened to hit. She was now listing dangerously, her plates sprung by near misses. The high-altitude bombers secured relatively few direct hits but did a great deal of damage below the waterline with near misses. Close bracket. Her master, Captain Robert Kerr, could see the fate of the Peary and saw men jumping into the oil-covered water. He called for volunteers to take one of the ship's boats through the bedlam on the harbour and try to pluck them from the water. All over the harbour, similar boats were being launched as volunteers set out to rescue sailors who had jumped or been blown off their ships. Charles Stewart was in the boat, and as they pushed off for the port side, another bomb dropped alongside her. 5 bombs had now struck home from the repeated attacks of the dive bombers, and Zealandia's remaining life was obviously going to be short. They picked up some survivors from the stricken Peary, and as they were returning, a dive bomber streaked overhead and released its bomb directly over a hatch on the hospital ship Manunda. The plane came back and began machine gunning their boat, but the pilot's aim with his gun was not as accurate as his bombing, and the shots all missed. No sooner had the plane gone when their engine died and they were left floating helplessly on the harbour, their 7 survivors, all terribly burnt, crying out for some relief. Only the arrival of one of the Manunda's boats, which had also been launched to go to the rescue of Peary's crew, and which took them in tow, prevented them from becoming target practice for a Japanese pilot. Best thing to do for the burn victims would have been to put them back in the water. Water, 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 immersion, salt water, normal saline, sea water, normal saline, immersion. They didn't know that then. When the order to abandon ship was given on the Zealandia, the officer of the watch, George Langley, sent the alarm to the engine room, urging the men to get out. Since the raid began, they had been frantically trying to repair the ship sufficiently to get up steam. Now the last of the crew went over the side into the boats, and they pulled away fast, fearful of being sucked down with their dying ship. From a distance they watched her give a last shudder before she sank to the bottom, still firmly held in place by the anchor that could not be raised. Perhaps the greatest incongruity of the raid on the harbour was the presence in the middle of so many ships that were quite legitimate targets for the Japanese Air Force of the hospital ship Manunda. She had been berthed only a cable's length, 200 metres, away from the destroyer Peary, which meant that she was quite within range of missiles intended for the warship, and she was not far from the British freighter, the British Motorist, which had recently arrived with a large cargo of oil and petrol to replace the local storage tanks. There were even some who suggested that by being anchored in this way, the Navy was in breach of the Geneva Convention for placing the hospital ship near a warship. At the time, her master was also reported to have complained that he had not been given more distance from the Peary, but later he insisted that he had been quite satisfied with his position. Critics suggested that he could really say little else when the final decision about where she should be anchored was his as captain. For the first 15 minutes of the attack on the harbour, the Japanese left the Manunda alone. Indeed, Fuchida had never intended to attack either the hospital ship or the hospital on shore, and even after the raid there were many Australian and American eyewitnesses who believed that she was hit by accident. The facts hardly support it, although Fuchida probably had more reason than usual to be careful. After Pearl Harbor, he had been ordered back to Tokyo and ushered into the Emperor's presence to assure him that no non-combatants or hospital ships had been bombed. He had given him that assurance. But Charles Stewart of the Zealandia had not the slightest doubt that the dive bomber which had released its bomb over the Manunda had not only done so deliberately, but had carefully aimed it so that it fell on a hatch just aft of the bridge. Yeah, and the bloke on the boat knows all about how accurate you can be with an aerial bomb 250 miles an hour, 50 foot off the water. Bullshit. I tend to believe the Japanese on this. The pilot, he said, then made 3 more approaches, each time machine gunning the hospital ship. Okay. Maybe he really didn't like Allied wounded. The bomb went through the skylight of a lounge that was used as a music room on B deck and turned the room into a mass of twisted debris. All that remained of a grand piano were a few strands of twisted wire and steel bulkheads, and the deck were buckled as though made of tin. But this was not the first or even the most damaging attack. On the ship, earlier in the battle, a near miss, probably aimed at Peary, had made Menunda tilt over alarmingly, and the decks had been sprayed with shrapnel from the explosion. 26-year-old Sister Margaret de Mestre was standing near the door and was hit in the back by a piece of shrapnel. She died 2 hours later. And 1 deck higher, another sister, Lorraine Blow from Sydney, was also standing near a door leading onto the deck when she too was struck by shrapnel. It fractured her spine, perforated her abdomen. She was in hospital for 2 years, but she didn't die. And after the war, she became a familiar figure at Sydney's Prince Alfred Hospital, where for 11 years she was in charge of the casualty department. 4 people died as a result of the near miss, and the direct hit claimed another 8, among them Melbourne dentist Boynes Hocking. In all, 10 officers and men of the ship's crew lost their lives, 7 people were seriously injured, and 51 had minor injuries. I think we'll have to stop it there because I'm pretty close to my upload time limit. Wobbles on a lot to YouTube here into part 4 of Australia's National Day of Shame. Book reading, Darwin, 1942. Ciao.